In the middle of a storm, a broken man drives through the night, desperate for a change. His job interviews have failed, his savings are gone, and his heart is heavy with grief. But as the rain pours down, something catches his eye. A woman, chained to a tree, abandoned and alone. Rescuing her seems like the right thing to do, but little does he know. This act of kindness will lead him down a path that will change both their lives forever. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. David's truck groaned under the weight of the rain that pounded against the windshield. The storm was relentless, as if the world itself was weeping with him. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale against the worn leather. The headlights barely pierced the curtain of water that stretched endlessly ahead. Everything around him felt blurred, like the world was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Another job interview, another "we'll call you." The words echoed in his head, a cruel reminder of all the doors that had been slammed in his face. He had tried over and over to make things work, but it always ended the same. The feeling of rejection gnawed at him, heavier with each passing day. But it wasn't just the job search that weighed on him. It was the sinking feeling that no matter how hard he tried, things would never be the same again. He glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter, Sophia, peacefully asleep in the back seat. Her tiny hands were clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, the one she'd had since she could remember. The sight of her brought a wave of love and sorrow, all tangled up in one. Sophia was the only thing David had left, the only part of his life that still made sense. His wife had been gone for 2 years now, and with her, everything else had fallen apart. The house, the job, the savings, even his confidence, all gone. But Sophia, she was his rock. She was all that mattered. David's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he made a sharp turn onto the winding road that led to their cramped one-bedroom rental. It was a place they had settled into after losing their home. A place too small for 2 people, but all they could afford. The heater in the truck coughed weakly, doing little to chase away the cold. It barely touched the chill that had settled deep in his bones. The road was familiar, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it felt like he was driving into a dark abyss, one that was closing in on him with each passing second. The windshield wipers squeaked in rhythm, each swipe like the ticking of a clock counting down to something he couldn't quite understand. Every day felt like a race against despair. Every step forward seemed to bring him 2 steps closer to a wall he couldn't climb. He could feel it in his chest, the slow crush of failure, the weight of expectations unmet. He couldn't let Sophia see it. He couldn't let her know how close he was to giving up. Not yet. Not for her. As he neared the bend in the road, something in the corner of his eye caught his attention. At first, it was just a flash of white, nothing more than a brief flicker in the storm. But then, as the truck's headlights swept across the dense trees lining the narrow road, the shape came into focus. It was something standing there, something out of place. David's heart skipped a beat. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt on the muddy shoulder of the road. His pulse raced, not from fear, but from a gut instinct that told him something was wrong. Without thinking, he threw open the door and stepped into the pouring rain. His boots sank into the soaked earth as he made his way toward the figure standing alone on the side of the road. The storm seemed to intensify around him, but he didn't care. Something was pulling him toward the figure, something he couldn't ignore. At first he thought it was a scarecrow or maybe even a mannequin, something discarded and left to rot in the rain. But as he drew closer, the truth hit him like a slap in the face. It was a woman. She was standing there, soaked to the bone, her wedding gown torn and filthy, her feet bare and caked in mud. Her arms trembled, bound to a tree with thick chains, her body slumped with exhaustion. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear, yet there was something haunting about them, a silent, desperate plea. David froze. Disbelief twisted in his chest as his mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His voice was almost drowned by the rain as he asked, "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. She didn't even move. David looked around hoping to see someone, anyone, but there was no one. No car, no house, no sign of life. It was just the woman, abandoned and alone in the storm. His heart clenched as he looked at her. Here he was, a man already drowning in his own problems. And yet in this moment, he couldn't walk away. Not from her. Not when she needed help. Not when he could do something. Without a second thought, he took off his coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. "You're safe now," he whispered, though he had no idea what he was getting himself into. He didn't know who she was or why she was here, but he knew one thing. She needed help, and he couldn't leave her behind. What he didn't know was that by rescuing her, he would begin to rescue himself too. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. As he helped the woman from the tree, her eyes remained locked on him, wide and hollow, like someone who had seen too much pain to ever trust again. He didn't know who she was, or how she had ended up there, but he knew that at that moment, he was her only hope. As he gently guided her back toward the truck, every step felt heavy and the cold rain seemed to blur the world around him. He couldn't leave her there, not in the rain, not in that state. She had been abandoned, chained, to a tree, and even though his own life was hanging by a thread, he couldn't walk away from someone else's suffering. He wasn't sure what drove him to act so quickly. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, pleading yet so broken. Or maybe it was simply the fact that, at that moment, she needed someone to care. He couldn't give her much, but he could offer her a little kindness, and that was all he had left to give. Once they reached the truck, David helped the woman into the passenger seat, careful not to jostle her too much. He shut the door softly, then rushed to the driver's side. He glanced at Sophia in the rearview mirror, still sound asleep, oblivious to the strange turn of events unfolding that night. He turned the key in the ignition, the old engine sputtering before it roared to life. The journey back to the apartment felt endless, the storm still raging, the headlights barely cutting through the curtain of rain. The drive was silent. The woman didn't speak, and neither did David. He didn't know what to say to her. What do you say to someone who's been through something so unimaginable? What words could fix the brokenness he saw in her eyes? He could offer her shelter, but that was about it. And yet, even though she remained quiet, David had the sense that she was aware of everything. She wasn't speaking, but her presence was heavy, almost as if she was trying to decide whether or not she could trust him. When they reached the apartment, David helped her out of the truck and into the small building. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the cold air seemed to follow them inside. He guided her to the couch and wrapped a blanket around her, trying to get her comfortable. Her body trembled under the weight of exhaustion, and for a moment, David found himself standing there unsure of what to do next. He looked at Sophia, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the stranger in their home. After a long pause, David finally spoke. "You're safe now," he said softly, trying to offer her some comfort. Though he had no idea what she had been through, she didn't respond. Instead, she just stared ahead, her eyes unfocused. He noticed that she wasn't really looking at anything in particular, but more like she was lost in her own thoughts, lost in a memory that was too painful to relive. David left her alone for a few moments, giving her time to adjust to her new surroundings. When he returned, he gently placed a cup of tea on the table in front of her, hoping it might bring some warmth. She looked at the tea but didn't move to take it. Her hands were still trembling, her face pale and worn. David wanted to ask her what had happened, but he knew it wasn't the right time. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words, but he didn't push her to talk. He looked at her again, noticing her clothes, the torn bridal gown, the mud and grime staining her skin. She had been through something terrible, something that had left her broken, and David could feel it in his own chest. The weight of her pain seemed to fill the room, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for the way his life had turned out. His problems, his struggles, seemed so small in comparison to the horror this woman had endured. Yet, despite all of that, she was still here, still breathing, still surviving. The rain continued to pour outside, its steady rhythm like a heartbeat in the background. David sat down at the small kitchen table, the chair creaking under his weight. He stared at the woman for a moment longer before finally speaking again. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Trying to break the silence, the woman blinked, as if the question took her by surprise. After a long pause, she whispered, "Sarah." The name was barely audible, but it was enough. "Sarah," David repeated softly as though tasting the name. "I'm David. This is Sophia," he said, motioning to the sleeping figure in the other room. "We're not much, but you're welcome to stay here as long as you need." Sarah looked at him then, her eyes briefly meeting his. For a moment there was a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, or maybe just a glimmer of trust. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She lowered her gaze to her hands, her fingers, still trembling slightly. David didn't know what to do next. He didn't know how to help her or if she even wanted help, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't turn away from her, not after everything she had been through. And in that moment, David realized that this woman, this stranger, had somehow brought something back to life in him. She had reminded him that there was still kindness in the world, still hope, and maybe, just maybe, that was all they both needed. The days that followed were quiet, filled with small moments of uncertainty. David didn't expect things to change overnight, but something was different. Sarah, the woman he had found chained to that tree, had not spoken much after that night. She mostly sat by the window staring out at the rain, lost in her own thoughts. But there was a calm about her now, a slight change in her posture as if the weight of her past had been momentarily lifted. She was still broken, still carrying the scars of what she had been through, but there was a soft, fragile glimmer of something new. It wasn't much, but David saw it. He saw the way her shoulders no longer slumped, the way she took small steps toward normalcy. Even the way she carefully folded the laundry or fixed the loose cabinet door in the kitchen showed that she was trying to put the pieces of her life back together, one small act at a time. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sophia, too, noticed the change. The quiet woman who had slept on their couch no longer felt like a stranger. Sarah had started, helping Sophia with simple tasks, folding clothes, sewing up her favorite stuffed rabbit that had torn at the seams. At first, Sophia had been hesitant, unsure of what to make of this new presence in their home. But over time, she warmed to Sarah. And for the first time in a long while, David heard Sophia's laughter. It wasn't a loud laugh or a playful giggle. It was a soft, hesitant sound, but it was a laugh. And that was more than David had heard in months. One afternoon, he walked into the living room to find Sarah and Sophia sitting on the floor, coloring together. Sophia's small hand was held in Sarah's, and she was showing her how to make a perfect circle with a crayon. David stood there for a moment watching them. The sight of it, of Sarah, the broken woman who had been left in the rain, now smiling softly as she helped his daughter, stirred something in him. He felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Sarah was healing in her own quiet way, and with her healing, so was he. David hadn't realized how much he had been holding in, how much of his own pain had been buried beneath the weight of trying to keep it together. But now, with Sarah's silent presence, he found himself breathing a little easier, letting the burden of his grief slip away piece by piece. As the days passed, David noticed more changes. The apartment, once dark and heavy with the weight of his own struggles, began to feel lighter. The air in the room wasn't so thick with sorrow anymore. The small, quiet moments between him, Sarah, and Sophia made the place feel warmer, fuller, like a home. It was a simple life, a modest life, but it was theirs. One evening, as the storm outside raged on, David sat at the kitchen table, sipping on a cup of lukewarm tea. Sarah was standing by the window, her eyes following the wind as it stirred the trees outside. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just familiar. David glanced over at her, watching her gaze out into the storm. He wanted to ask her what had happened, what she had been through, but he wasn't sure if she was ready to speak about it. He knew her past was filled with pain, but he didn't want to push her. Not yet. Sarah's voice broke the silence, soft and fragile. I was supposed to be married that day, she said, her words hanging in the air like a quiet confession. David looked up, his heart tightening in his chest. Her voice cracked, the weight of her memories spilling into the room. It wasn't love, she continued, her gaze still fixed on the rain outside. I didn't love him. I didn't even know him. Her words were a quiet whisper, but they carried the weight of so many unspoken truths. My family. They said love was a luxury, she added, her voice thick with pain. They said it was about duty, about honor. I ran away, they found me. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. They left me there, chained to that tree. To think about what I had done, the room felt still, the air heavy with the weight of her story. David sat motionless, his heart aching for her. He didn't know what to say. How could he understand what she had gone through? How could he ever make sense of the cruelty she had experienced? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let her believe she was too lost. He stood up slowly, walking over to where she stood by the window. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. You were never too lost, he said, his words soft but firm. You just needed someone to see your worth. Someone who would find you. Sarah's eyes welled with tears and David's heart broke at the sight. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't rescue. It was recognition. Two broken souls, standing in the middle of their pain, beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they still deserved something beautiful. The storm outside raged on, but inside, in that small, quiet apartment, the healing had begun. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was real. For the first time in a long time, David allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something better, something more. For Sarah, for Sophia, and for himself. 1 year had passed since Sarah had first come into their lives, and David could hardly recognize the person he had been that night. The apartment, once dark and filled with sorrow, now felt full of warmth. It was still small, the peeling paint on the walls still there, but there was a sense of peace that had settled in. The sun streamed through the windows every morning, casting soft light over the room, and laughter, real laughter, could be heard echoing through the apartment. David stood in the kitchen that morning, flipping pancakes for breakfast. The smell of warm syrup filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet joy in his chest. His face, which had once been weary and filled with sadness, was now lit with contentment. The past year had changed him, transformed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had always thought he was the one helping Sarah, that he was the one rescuing her from the darkness of her past, but in reality, it had been Sarah who had helped him. As David poured the batter into the pan, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, a gentle smile on her face. She had become a steady presence in their home, someone who brought a sense of calm to every moment. Her clothes were no longer ragged, her hair was clean, and though she still carried the weight of her past, it didn't define her anymore. Sarah had found herself again, and David couldn't help but feel proud of how far she had come. Sophia, too, had changed. The little girl who had once been quiet and unsure now ran around the apartment, her laughter filling the air as she played with her toys. She had grown close to Sarah, referring to her as Mom, without hesitation. David had never heard Sophia speak the word with such love before, and it warmed his heart. What had once been an empty house, filled with the echoes of pain, was now a home full of love, laughter, and the sound of joy. The morning routine had become a dance of sorts. Sophia would sit at the kitchen table, eating her breakfast while David and Sarah worked together to get everything ready. Sarah had taken on the role of mother in a way that seemed so natural. She didn't try to replace the woman who had been Sophia's mother, but in her quiet way, she had become just as important to Sophia. She was the one who helped with schoolwork, who braided Sophia's hair every morning, and who listened to her little stories with patience and care. She had found her place in their family, and it felt like she had always belonged. One day, as they sat at the kitchen table, David noticed how different everything felt. They had all come so far. The weight that had once pressed down on his shoulders, threatening to break him, had lessened. It wasn't gone completely. He still had moments of doubt, of worry about the future, but he no longer felt trapped in the darkness. He had found a way out, and he had found it with Sarah by his side. David had also found a steady job at a local school, working in maintenance. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and most importantly, it gave him a sense of purpose. He no longer spent his days wondering if he would make it through another week, another month. He had something solid to hold on to, and that stability had given him peace of mind. The feeling of having a job, of providing for his family, was something he had been missing for so long. Sarah, too, had found a new purpose. What had once been a woman broken by shame and despair had transformed into someone who helped others. Sarah volunteered at a local shelter for women who had been through similar experiences to her own. She spoke to the women there, sharing her story, offering them hope, and showing them that they could start over. She had become a voice for those who were too afraid to speak, and in doing so, she had found her strength. One evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, David and Sarah sat together on the porch. The air was warm and the sky was dark, filled with stars. They didn't talk much. There was no need. Their hands were entwined, and in the silence, they both understood. They had been through so much, and yet here they were, together. They had both been broken, but in their brokenness they had found something unshakable. They had found each other. Do you remember that night? David asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. When we found her chained to that tree? Sarah nodded, a bittersweet smile on her lips. I remember it like it was yesterday. It feels like a lifetime ago, David said, squeezing her hand. So much has changed. It has, Sarah agreed. Her gaze turned toward the horizon. But we're not the same people anymore. We've both been given a second chance. The words hung in the air between them, a simple truth. They had both been given a second chance at life, at love, and at happiness. And as they sat together on that porch, watching the stars flicker in the night sky, they knew that they had built something beautiful, something worth holding on to. They had found their way through the darkness, and together they would continue to build a future filled with hope. For the first time in a long time, David believed in the possibility of tomorrow, and in that belief he found peace.